Let's do a quick introduction. Kyle, you start for Eric and I to use.
Kyle Mohan Racing. I've done rotary engine work now for over 20 years. I worked at Mazda Tricks for over 18 years, and I've ran my own rotary drifting team now for over 20 years. I think cumulatively I've been playing with rotaries for probably closer to 25 years, but I just love rotaries. I blame Gran Turismo. I love racing. And I really just enjoy getting to share this passion with everybody, and that's why I'm here tonight.
Yeah. Eric, you want to go?
Yeah, I guess I can actually address the camera a little bit. I like the side view more than the straight on from work. But so my name's Eric Hof, also known as Mr. Rad for the Rad Potential YouTube channel. I bought RX-7s about 10 years ago, and basically Rod Millen's RX-7 rally car is what hooked me on these cars. That and Fast and Furious 1. The cutscene in Fast and Furious 1, you go through a rotary engine and just what is that? So that's why I've always loved them. They sound cool. I've been building these engines, I guess, for about 8 years. Whenever I moved down to Nashville, was living with my buddy Charles and his son-in-law. They had RX-7s. Just literally met them at a car show. And ultimately, just one of my life things is sharing rotaries, sharing your passion with other people is one of my favorite things to do. We put a rotary engine in my rally car and went and raced rally this past weekend and had a good time with tons of people who had never heard a Bridgeport Brat before. So it was super fun to share the knowledge and love trying to learn and tinker with things. And that's ultimately, the hybrid stuff is what we're here to talk about.
Yeah. And I guess I'm Mitchell. I run a handful of media accounts racing with Mitchell, and I just like to make fun content. I had an NC Miata that I loved. I wanted a back seat that my son could ride in his car seat. And that meant I got a RX-8 because it's the only car that I could tow with my daily driver. And now I'm just learning how to live with a rotary, trying to at least. So now I'm just trying to build a rotary engine that impresses my son. But I have no building experience, which you guys will see in this video. Actually, I assembled my engine by watching Eric's videos, Kyle's, a handful of yours. There was another individual on YouTube that I forgot the name of, but yeah. So I know nothing about these things. I'm just here collecting information to share with my tuner.
My channel, I will show every single part of every single thing, good, bad, or good. So
yep.
And I always love learning, whether it was a good learning or bad. But
right.
Just here to support, give knowledge, do whatever, talk. Thoughts will come up as we talk, I bet. So
yeah. And it's funny, I'm kind of in the same boat. I mean, I pulled my car apart. It had ate a corner seal, and I was like, all right, well, I need rotor housings anyway, and they are cheaper. And I think honestly, by the time I got the machining done for the RX-7 Apex seals, I think my cost came out just slightly above a factory Renesis rebuild. So I honestly don't think I'm really that deep into it. It's like, even if the car does make slightly less power or more, way less, I don't really care. So
Yeah,
go ahead.
I was just going to say from our perspective, when we did the first one, which was actually years ago, when I was working at Mazda Tricks, we kind of came at it with a very planned build with technical data to support it from other engines in the 13D and naturally aspirated racing categories. So we kind of had a really good idea going in that what we were doing was going to work in the realm that we were putting it in. And I think it'll be interesting to talk about it because it's always been a thought, will it work in a stock car? And what will it do naturally aspirated? And I have some thoughts and some hearsays on that, and just look forward to discussing it. But our approach when we first did it was very much based on us feeling like, oh yeah, we know this is going to work for our application.
Yeah. Maybe that's where we start. Kyle, I think you have the most experience with the hybrid, obviously. And I think you even said just now that was it your first or the first hybrid? I know that there are some hybrids in other countries and continents, but I'm really just familiar with yours specifically, and then a couple of one-offs that I talked to guys on Facebook about.
Yeah, so I mean, I started my career really at Mazda Tricks in the rotary world. I worked there for about 18 years. Since have broke off, I have my own shop. I started my racing career at Mazda Tricks. I helped them develop some of their racing stuff, and they helped me develop a lot of stuff. So I worked around a good group of guys and engine builders that came from different areas. So there was just a lot of knowledge there. And basically, when we set out to build that first Renesis hybrid motor, we knew of people talking about the idea, and we had heard hearsay that somebody had done it in Australia and that it had worked. And that was basically all we needed. We were trying to win a Moto IQ championship with the Mazda Trix RX-8 car, and we had gone through a Greddy Turbo. Didn't really like its total performance possibilities. It was cool though. And then we went to a supercharger kit, and that had its limitations. We were breaking some stuff. And then we decided, well, we're trying to win. We want to do something with the RX-8 block that maybe other people can do. We want to find out if there's potential here. And we had kicked around the idea from like right when we first saw the motors, like what happens if you put a GSLSE rotor housing in there? Because fundamentally, all the dimensions lined up, bolt patterns. It was like Mazda gave the idea and just didn't do it. So I don't know if we were necessarily the first. We had heard about it, and we'd been thinking about it at Mazda Tricks as an accumulation of shop prior to doing it. But I think we were the first people to do it in the United States, and we successfully documented it. It I think got 2 features in Moto IQ and did win, or at least podium, in the West Coast Moto IQ Championship that year with 0 failures on that motor. And it's been brought up. People are like, "Oh, you guys blew up a lot of motors." Yeah, we did. We blew up a couple stock RX-8 motors. Then we blew up a couple supercharged motors. And I don't believe we ever had a failure with the hybrid, although I think it only did like a handful of races, maybe 5 to 10 races. And that car got retired and sold, and the motor went away. And in our idea, we always knew we were going to boost it because we had horsepower goals. And we always knew we were going to go standalone computer with it. We had all these things that we knew we were going to do. And really, we felt good about it because you can boost a 6-port motor. The 1986 to 89 motors, 91 motors, are fundamentally a very similar intake design. And then when you look at your exhaust port timing of a Renesis block, and then you stack any 13B generation peripheral exhaust housing on there, you're fundamentally just giving it the peripheral exhaust timing. It opens sooner and closes essentially later than the side ports. So that's where the majority of your timing is going to come from. And we had done naturally aspirated and turbocharged 86 to 91 6-port motors that had both intake porting done and exhaust porting done. So fundamentally, as long as the side ports didn't interfere, there was no exaggeration of intake exhaust timing. It was beyond anything that had been done in the 13B world before. So it gave us a pretty good idea. We were like, all right, this should work. And first try out, it worked turbocharged. And we've never built a naturally aspirated one or tested it.
Okay, so that Moto IQ car was boosted.
Yeah, turbocharged T4.
Okay.
Not even a ball bearing turbo. It was a bushing turbo. And between 12 and 14 PSI, we were landing in the 400 to 440 horsepower range, depending on how aggressive we got on the timing. We wanted it to be safe and reliable, high compression rotors, and we were only running 105 octane race gas. So we ended up keeping it a little mild on the timing, and per the rules of that class, it was a weight to horsepower, so they would dyno the cars at the track or prior to at official dynos. So we ended up locking it in like right around 400 or 410 or something like that based on the weight. We're good. It was very reliable.
So that was a high compression hybrid turbo.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, because I don't really believe you're going to get away with on any long-term time. I've never personally tested this, but I think Mazda put the scraper ring in to protect the oil control rings from the heat saturation of the side port exhaust. So if you're expecting a hybrid to last a long time. I don't know if you'd be able to get away with running like FD rotors or FC rotors where you could drop compression. I think it's easier to scallop, face, alter the compression of an RX-8 rotor if you really had to, than it would be to maybe risk what could happen with heat saturation on the oil control rings or things like that. Again, I've never tested that, but the one person who did was Land Speed RX-8, and he ran FD rotors in a Renesis block with methanol, so a very cool burning fuel for a short amount of time or long time in a race car, but and he had success. So he's an advocate for being able to run those other generations of rotors. But again, I go with what I've successfully done. And we never tried that because the side seals are further out on an RX-8 motor, and that exposes them to the RX-7 side seal to falling into the intake ports. So your total lifespan of a RX-7 rotor shouldn't be as good as a Renesis rotor in a RX-8 intake configuration. We just didn't bother trying it. It looked dangerous. It looked like a potential problem, so it was so much easier to run high octane, um, and just use RX-8 rotors, which are high compression from the factory, and then deepen the apex seal groove, which, as long as it's done correctly, actually gives some performance advantages and gives the apex seal extra beam strength, which will allow it to cross over that exhaust port more sustainably.
Okay. Interesting.
Yeah.
I'll be honest, a lot of this stuff went right over my head. Eric, I see you chugging along. You're good. And I'm over here like, okay, yeah, that makes sense. I don't know yet, but
yeah, I read all the forums, all the RX-8 club posts. I've seen pictures of the old Mazda Trick setup. I've followed the Land Speed guy, so I've seen all of, or at least most of his test stuff on it. My hybrid, I didn't want to try RX-7 Apex or RX-7 rotors in it for the same reason. I literally just took one and rolled it over the plate, and you can feel where the side seal is going to dip down. And I've had side seals break off over the intake port on just regular RX-7, so it's why I expose it to extra risk. The interesting thing that I think, from Kyle's experience would just be the intake that you guys used on your hybrid setup. I feel like I've seen pictures of it and it was a little bit more custom than just a stock RX-8 intake. So I don't know if you have any collaborations on that, because that's where I think turbo, the main shape and flow of the intake isn't the most important because it's still just being pressurized. But at the same time, there's definitely gains to be had improving the intake even while boosted, but yeah.
Yeah, you want me to talk about the Mazda Tricks intake configuration first, and then maybe I'll talk about my thoughts on the stock intake second,
Yeah,
if that sounds good.
perfect.
So you're absolutely right. The Mazda Tricks intake manifolding was not stock, and when we look at boosted motors, rotary motors in general, whether you're using 4-port motors from the Turbo 2, the Cosmo, or the FD, or you're taking a 6-port motor from the 80s and 90s and adding boost, generally for performance, you're getting rid of actuators, and you're trying to optimize flow. So less of the necessity for actuators and secondaries, because that's increasing flow speed at the bottom end. But when you have a turbo, you're just trying to get air in there. So our whole thought was, just like we had learned in the past with trying to get peak horsepower, not bottom end performance, but peak horsepower and reliability, it was all right, on the bottom intake it's a stock RX-8 manifold, but we ported it and polished it and set the center drum to open, and we eliminated the bottom actuators, so they just simply couldn't work. And we were on a Haltech computer, so there's a whole different topic to talk about here when we talk about using a stock computer. But with our application, it was a Haltech, and so we basically made the lower half like an old school turbo manifold or 6-port manifold. It's just going to flow in, no actuators, made some little block offs to fill the voids, capped up any vacuum ports, gave it a little port and polish, cleaned it up for efficiency purposes, and then the upper half is plastic. And I think you could get away with the upper half. I don't know how much boost it'll hold, but I know it'll hold 7 to 10, 12 psi because I've seen people do it. But we were
Mhm.
able to get an aftermarket, and I believe it was the Pettit Racing upper intake that they used to make for their supercharger kits. And we found like a new old stock that was damaged, got a hold of it, made some modifications to it. And I think we ended up running just a single butterfly. And
Mhm.
not the best again for bottom end response or mid range when it comes to rotaries tunability. We were kind of going with more of the plenum idea. Again, why we saw those peak horsepower numbers that are rather good on our dyno charts was because we just basically straight lined everything. I think it was a 90 mil throttle body, Pettit Racing aluminum upper that was port matched to the factory lower, zero actuator movement, just blow air in, get air out, make power. And it worked out quite well. We went to aftermarket injectors. And just by eliminating all of the stock throttle body, which is definitely going to be a limitation, and we can talk about that, and eliminating the stock computer and any of the actuators. Obviously, you're going to give up a little bottom end if that was important, but probably not if you're building a boosted hybrid.
Mhm.
Um, and uh, and that was kind of a trying to remember if we even ever modified anything. Um, I think it worked because it was a pretty much just we're trying to un RX8 intake and make
Mhm.
it function like a turbocharged RX-7 intake would have, or
Yeah.
aftermarket intake would have. So then getting to like if you're going to try to use a naturally aspirated setup with OEM intake, I think I have concerns. It doesn't mean I don't think it'll work, and I think there's a lot to talk about here. But the first things that come up is I don't know if you even would want some of those actuators doing things, and the changed air flow rates and what the computer's seeing. And because all of that intake manifold was designed with the idea that there wouldn't be overlap, and you're
Mhm.
instantly giving it overlap, and now your reversion pulses and what that air is doing is going to be different. What the computer sees is going to be different. I could instantly see that being a source of issue. And I would probably then say, how do we eliminate some of that actuator movement and still allow the OEM computer to function? And I don't know if that's even possible. I don't know if I've ever heard of anybody trying to do it. I know on the old 6-port stuff, like the RX-7s, it was vacuum operated.
Mhm.
So you could just wire it open and the computer would just be
Mhm.
like, oh, I got more air, whatever. But I don't know if we can get away with doing something like that to the RX-8. And then it would bring me to, well, maybe we can start to reflash the OEM computer to hopefully either bypass some of those functional issues or start to see what it is that's causing it to obviously limit the horsepower. Is it way too lean? Is it the EGR system not being happy with there suddenly being back pressure, if it's even there? Because I actually am not as familiar with your setup as I probably should be. It's like, but those are all of the things that I would be concerned about and try to get around. Just try to eliminate, get around, bypass. So you're getting down to a setup that would function as much as possible like the older RX-7 setups, which
Yeah.
might require some reflashing or by piggybacking or something like that.
Yeah, like in my case, whenever we put mine together, like obviously it starts and runs and like it's still a
That's
normal
good.
Renesis engine at low RPM. Like you could
Mm.
make a reliable car that drives around, I think, with a hybrid. But I think like ultimately you're gonna have to change the intake or figure out a way to tune it better because like right at 3,000 to 4,000 RPM, the car just gets horribly confused with its airflow. Like it just doesn't know what's going on. It go like mine, it went super rich, and it was just bogging and bogging. And then you get to 7,000 and it picks back up. But at that point, like everything's open, it's just flowing air in and out,
So
I think that's where it was, kind of a mess. With VersaTuner on the stock ECU, you can't really you can do more than you think, but you can't do that much. Like you can't. It'd be nice if you could just tell it, I want to lock the SSV and the auxiliary ports and everything open, and you not complain about it, like the ECU, right? But I don't think you can do that. You can tell it when to open them, but you can't really, really just confuse it to some extent, I guess. Like on a standalone, you can just not use that as an output or input or not do anything with it, and it doesn't care. Same thing with just MAF based tuning, right? So like mass airflow based versus MAP pressure based gets a little bit variable once you start changing the amount of air that can come in or out, of the engine drastically, which we're going to battle that on my yellow RX-8, like turboing a stock ECU car, which Ernie's done before, and that's a whole different topic. But I just think there's a lot more, the RX-8 intake was designed for the Renesis 6-port engine. Like that's what it was optimized for, and they spent a ton of time and money making it work. So for somebody like me or any of us, like we're smarter than these Mazda people that spent millions of dollars making this work. It's interesting to try to change it and expect good results. You know what I mean? Because I don't know, even doing a Bridgeport on a regular Renesis doesn't, like we did the Gears and Gasoline, their setup, which their videos will be coming out, and it picked up some power, but it's not the difference of 80 horsepower on a 12A to 230 horsepower on a Bridgeport 12A. You know what I mean? It's like we got maybe 8 horsepower out of it doing a Bridgeport and some tuning, but the juice isn't worth the squeeze, so to speak, right? In that case,
So let me get up to speed on the intake real quick. So my understanding is, it sounds like, and I wasn't aware of this, you cannot do much with the SSVs on the RX-8 factory ECU is what you're telling me. And your guys' thoughts are that those trying to stay closed at lower RPMs are going to hurt performance because of that overlap.
Yeah, I mean, the overlap is going to push air into them when they're closed, which is going to just cause some weird stuff in the intake that the ECU is not going to see that. It's happening down there in the engine, not so much up by where it's measuring airflow. So that was kind of my thought why it's getting confused. Before those are opening, the overlap's throwing it off all weird. And even like mine was a Bridgeport hybrid. I know Mitchell's is just a stock intake port hybrid. Yep. So mine had way more overlap given the situation, but that's where I think it's getting confused, because even on just a regular street port sometimes, or even a Bridgeport Renesis, the SSV will flutter and it'll tick, to sound like you have like a lifter tick in a rotary engine, just sits there and clicks.
Good enough.
So that's that overlap pushing and pulling air to some extent. But yeah, the ECU, you can control when they open.
Okay.
But it can't see what's happening past the throttle body and mass airflow sensor. So it's not really able to do anything about it. And what I think Kyle's mentioning too, Mitchell, if you're not familiar with the 6-port stuff, is the old school 6-port FC stuff. It's all mechanically vacuum operated. There's no check engine light if it doesn't work. So you just go in there and wire them open, and they're open all the time. And you lose some bottom end power, the car will still run fine. The ECU won't care, but it'll pick up a little bit more, kind of mid top end, and it doesn't have to open them with vacuum. They just stay open. But on the 8, like if you wired the aux port open or even the SSV open, the ECU is gonna be like, this thing isn't working. It's freaking out. It won't, because it has a limit or has a switch on them to know if they're working properly. And it's not going to know what to do. I think is kind of, that's where my head goes. I wish there was a way to trick it, but
so nobody's
without a standalone. You're going to have to.
So there is no delete on a factory ECU is what you're telling me. And there is no way to just say, hey, stay open. Because if you try to essentially force it to stay open at all RPMs, the computer is just going to freak out. Interesting. I didn't know that there's nothing you could do about that on a factory ECU. And if I remember correctly, we are trying to use Mazda Edit for reference.
Mm-hmm. So I essentially agree with everything you just said. I think that is probably what's happening. Something in that area based on overlap, EGR, and the SSVs. And up until right now, I've actually never discussed it beyond what we did in Mazda Tricks. whether or not there is a workaround. So it is something that I will now. I'll talk to some of the tuning people I know. I think you guys are probably correct though, and just that as of right now, I don't know of a workaround. I think the workaround would be similar to what we did on our Mazda Tricks race car, but maybe it could be done more efficiently these days. But find some type of piggyback style engine ECU where you're just really getting down to maybe just controlling the engine side and still allowing the factory ECU to handle the gauges, the steering, the other fundamentals of the car. Um, which is interesting in the RX-8s because they're actually a CAN car, an early CAN system car,
Mhm.
and they're even sensitive to wheel speed. Like when you put an RX-8 on a dyno, it can see that the front tires aren't rolling, that the rear tires are, and it actually detunes it based on exhaust temperatures. So even dynoing a factory ECU car is kind of a horrible experience. But I was
Yeah.
expecting better results, and it all makes sense. Though I think you said it kind of has the issues between 35 and around 7, and there's two things: there's injector staging and SSV staging that's happening right in there. And you're right, like it probably only exacerbated that issue by having it be also bridge ported. Not going to
Yeah, yeah.
say that it would be any different with a street port, but that's like adding overlap to
Oh, yeah.
something that isn't seeming to like overlap.
Yeah.
And we didn't know.
Yeah,
For
and
sure. I mean, like,
I didn't
don't
know.
like.
Yeah.
There's a lot of people who just they and I guess before I go down that topic thing, the mention here is like Ernie has an Adaptronic like plug and play for an RX-8, and I would be curious to take that plug and play and run an NA hybrid with that because basically he can not run he does in his Turbo 8, which is what that ECU is on. He doesn't have an SSV; it's pulled out, blocked off. The VDI is wired open, which is the top little butterfly thing, and then the auxiliary port sleeves are removed. So it's very similar to your Mazda Trix setup, but it's still a stock wiring harness. It's a stock ECU thing plugs in, right? And he can turn all that off in the Adaptronic. But I think the big thing it changes is it switches it from mass airflow to map pressure tuning. So now, even in it wouldn't be that beneficial. You could rescale the math, but that just makes it way more simpler, for the ECU to read that like, hey, we're just at max vacuum. It's not going to see all the weird pulses and overlaps so much. Might be a little smoother than math tuning, but I'd be curious to if we went back and retried to like go bug Ernie to take his Adaptronic out. Those ECUs are getting hard to find. So if you're trying to
Yeah.
do like the Adaptronic plug and play Turbo RX-8, like they're like $700 or $800, but they don't come up for sale often, because I can't even. I would love to buy one, but I can't find one to buy. So and it's tough to justify the like $3,000 to Haltech plug and play Nexus R3 thing to actually make the CAN bus happy. And at the end of the day, it's still an RX-8, which is hard to, you
yeah.
want to spend that much money on one, but
Hey, keep in mind we're about to get
Um,
snow, and so my car's going to be in the garage for months on end. If
Yeah.
you think you'd be interested in filming some content, putting that on my car, testing it, and then taking it off, I'd be all right with that. That's
I
a
mean,
real
it could be
offer.
literally as simple as like his car, you just unplug the ECU and plug it into yours. He has tunes saved, so we could just flash it back to like more of a stock tune
Yeah,
without the boost and try it. Like if you're going to the dyno or doing whatever, I'm sure he'd be okay with it. Ernie's all about learning stuff, but that's
yeah,
like Kyle mentioning like tricking a stock ECU or figuring out how to make the RX-8 the chassis happy, and it does weird stuff. The chassis does. It's a very smart car, in the sense of it's a very performancey engineered car. But it's not really designed around being modified easily, right? So
which is
once you
odd.
start adding complexity, then changing stuff gets harder. But that'd be an interesting thing to test,
Yeah. Yeah.
But,
And just talking about the overlap concerns with the Bridgeport and how it's going to essentially pile up on that SSV, it sounds like I'm really excited to put your header on my car and just eliminate that other controversial, you know,
Mhm.
variable and actually see what that porting does. I assume we're going to lose power, but if it's really this efficient, it makes me wonder, is there a couple horsepower in there? I know you never dynoed your car with the with the header in its current status,
Mhm.
but I still think I still think your description is really good. Still feels like it's under factory power levels. So if we put mine on the dyno and all of a sudden it's coming out just under factory power levels, we'll be like, okay, well, not much has changed. Or, if it's back down to 100 horsepower, heaven forbid, I still think we have a good finger in the air, or I guess wind in the air, whatever the phrase is, test on how much this is really going to change. So I'm really excited. I'll be honest, I didn't think the intake was as big of a deal, but that's just because I don't know. I know my tuner has been legitimately trying to warn me about this stuff. Just for background, Eric, I know I told you, but Kyle, I didn't tell you. When I originally did this, I told my tuner, I said, we're going to be doing a Bridgeport because this is all around content creation, so it's got to get everybody's attention. And I said, I'm even down for a little bit of power loss. And then when it came around to it, he's like, just let me street port it. And I was like, all right, you know what? At that point, let's just run it stock just to see what happens.
Mm-hmm.
So
I think that's all what needs to happen. And it's interesting how sensitive the RX-8 is to intake and exhaust, kind of what you were mentioning earlier. It's like you do all this porting and all this modification and you pick up like 5 to 8 horsepower. And that's exactly what we've seen. I think one of the touring car teams picked up between 5 and 9 with the Bridgeport, and all the original street port gains without any excessive tuning, even sometimes with reflashing, we're talking like 5 to 7 horsepower. So it's like you're spending a lot of time and money to get pretty small gains anywhere with the RX-8. I always tell people, street port it when it's apart. So you don't take it apart to street port it. Like when it's apart, you port it, cap back, intake filter, flywheel, coilovers, and enjoy the car. They're just really fun cars. And unless you're going to boost it or get really exotic and go way outside of what I would consider a street car, and some of that is because I'm in California and we have such strict emissions. It's hard to really flex what it can do. I think a limitation, and we kind of touched on it, is potentially the throttle body. You're trying to move so much air volume with that motor, and what's happening is potentially the smallest thing is starting to become the throttle body. If you look at what other RX-7s have ran, or what kind of volume you do on an aftermarket build, if we build a Bridgeport 13B for like GT racing, totally comparable. It's like if you Bridgeported a hybrid build, I'd expect you need like a 51 IDA downdraft style setup on it, or something equivalent to, you're probably moving 90, 100 millimeters of air to get higher horsepower gains. One of the things the Renesis did was they kept everything on the smaller side to really emphasize mid-range performance. When we talk about horsepower gains, we're usually talking about upper end performance, and that means bottom end and mid range get sacrificed. But like if you do have the opportunity to play with the Adaptronic, I'd love to see what it would do with maybe a different throttle body on there. And then for my own personal kind of wants and projects, I think I want to run my hybrid Renesis Street Port. That's been sitting for a year and everybody's mad at me, but I've been broke and busy.
I've been one following it. I've been one waiting on the updates.
I think what I kind of intend to do is run it naturally aspirated to start with, but none of the stock intake. I would just go to an aftermarket intake. If you're not trying to pass smog, literally I would just throw all that RX-8 intake away and pick your favorite aftermarket setup. Something that's potentially been used before. And then with your header, you want your collector approximately a motor and a half length back from the motor. So probably 30 to 40% further than what most RX-8 manifolds collect that. And it's just a hard spot to collect into the cats and stuff. But to optimize performance based off what we've seen in the touring cars, it's like a little more intake volume and a little bit better header design, and you get a little bit of a gain on the top end. And if there's a restriction in exhaust or any restriction or not optimization of intake, then you actually, you come out with a loss in the bottom end and not really a gain in the top end, which people do talk about. Just a sensitive car.
Yeah, the thing that's interesting too, I think it'd be a good segue right here is like the guy that I talked to in New Zealand that has a hybrid, and he made 213 or something, 220 horsepower out of it. He actually used a 4-port Renesis, and then He semi-peripheral ported it, made a custom 4-port, with the semi-peripheral port intakes, and then a custom upper piece with a bigger throttle body and stuff. And he only ran the peripheral exhaust and just welded like a plate across all the ports, and only the peripheral ports came out of it. And like that is very far from what would be some sort of reasonably affordable or what somebody could do, like to be able to weld aluminum and have the housing semi-peripheral ported and then do a custom upper intake and the custom header. Like it just, it becomes pretty custom at that point, like you said, which doesn't really make it the best. If you're going to put all that time and money into something, like you might as well just do an REW or some better setup, because it's not that much more expensive if you're wanting that much power out of it, I guess.
Yeah.
In A, right? You're kind of taking the soul of the RX-8 away too at that point, but it's just an interesting.
Yeah, I want to jump in there.
It really had to make it breathe to get it to work, and it was I've got the dyno graph somewhere in my messages. It's like all peak horsepower. It looks like a pretty hopped up 6-port engine, like just with pulling real hard past 5,800, but really not too much going on below it,
That's going to be the case with basically any semi-peripheral port or Bridgeport motors. They're not going to turn on until 5,000.
Yep.
I think that's where I want to
There's
jump
nothing down low, and then
just kind of speaking to that whole, essentially why I think there's so many people interested in the hybrid. I think people want to see that there's something to do with the Renesis beyond just throw an intake and exhaust and drive it the way it is. There's nothing left, which I'm not doubting. I have zero doubts that people like you two have, done what you can. But I think there's still a group of people that are like, well, come on, there's got to be something beyond just shilling out the money for a REW. Oh my gosh, if I get one more comment, put an REW in it, just be done with it. I'm just gonna sell the car and go buy an NC again. Yeah. Listen, I'm not doubting the REW is a great motor. I would love to have one. I just don't want to spend the money on it.
Yeah. So that's why we did the hybrid, and we figured like if you're going to commit to putting an REW in an RX-8, why not figure out a configuration that would create similar horsepower numbers and require similar modifications?
Yeah.
And still use the Renesis. And that really was our goal. It's dollars to dollars. It's like, hey, REW blocks are getting harder to find. You can do this with a Renesis. You got to fabricate anyways. Let's not joke around. You're gonna drop 10 to 30 grand, doing a swap.
Yeah.
Like if cheap total out, or even that's a budget at 30. I mean, $150,000 builds all the time.
Yeah. Honestly, in my opinion, I'm really excited to own a rotary, especially after seeing all the videos. But if I'm spending 10 to 13 grand to swap to make, what kind of power would that make of the REW?
I mean,
400?
It depends on how big of a turbo you want. You can make horsepower on the 2-rotor.
But I feel like honestly at that point,
800.
I hate this swap, but I'm probably just doing the LFX swap. There's been so much success with the LFX and the RX-8 over in autocross and on track to somebody like me who just wants something that turns over. And don't get me wrong, I am dying to get my damn car running. My car should have been running last week, and I kind of got lazy. And I'm really excited for it to be a rotary, specifically because it'll sound different to my 1.5-year-old son, so he'll think his dad's car is a race car, and that's really all I want. Mm-hmm. But yeah. So I want to go back. Kyle, you talked about putting a different throttle body with the Versatuner. Why specifically with the Versatuner? Is there any interest on essentially stock hybrid like I've got?
Yeah, I still think there's potentially hope. We just got to work around a couple things and see what it's doing.
Well, I'm saying specifically with the throttle body. Is there an issue with using that on a factory ECU?
Well, it's fly-by-wire, and when you start to have the computer, like was discussed, malfunction or misread what is happening potentially in intake or exhaust flow, and then also the addition of overlap is going to change. Especially with a Bridgeport, it's going to, or a semi-peripheral port, it's going to change what your O2 reading should be, because you have a lot more wasted fuel at that point. Something the RX-8 ECU has no calculation for. It doesn't know what to do. And I could easily see the information that the computer is getting causing the throttle body to limit, because you can go wide open throttle, but that's not what the throttle body does. It does what the ECU says. And so let's start to eliminate factors if we could in some way. Maybe not the Versatuner, or maybe something that you can start to eliminate, like that actuator, and hey, put on a aftermarket full cable, throttle body. And I mean, keep it simple, get it on dyno and pull it by hand if you have to. A little known fact is you can actually bolt a Turbo 2 RX-7 mechanical gas pedal into an RX-8. They share the same bolt pattern, so that gives you a mechanical gas pedal if you need it, and then you can run like a 89 Turbo 2 throttle cable. It's all bolt-on stuff. Very very random, but it does it. And so I think, getting down to trying to solve the problem, like you said, if you did a street port, we're still going to have overlap, but we're going to have significantly less, and we're going to have significantly less wasted fuel into the exhaust that's getting read by O2, that's sending a tuning message to the ECU. And we'd at least see if there's a change. Like you said, maybe it's worse, maybe it's better. If it's better, it gives hope. And then if you start to eliminate ECU as a potential, or actuators as a potential, you really can then start to discover what the problem is. It very well could be the introduction of overlap to a ECU that doesn't know how to calculate for that. You know,
By the
and
way,
it seems like there should be a way to get around that.
Yeah.
Interesting. By the way, if you guys see me looking all over, I'm looking at messages from my tuner because I was talking to him about questions I may want to ask and jotting down notes. So I'm listening. I'm just also trying to bring in other points to the conversation. So we've kind of danced around it, but I think one of the largest points of contention in I say forums, it's the dead Facebook group, is the header. You've got to block the center port, they say. You got to block the center port. You got to block the side ports. Kyle, you seem amped up. Let me hear it.
You said it earlier. I mean, first of all, you're just going to remove the soul from what the Renesis is. You might as well put an RX-7 motor in it. If you run 6-port and 4-port intake, and then you run peripheral exhaust, all you did is reinvent an RX-7 motor. Congratulations. Like, you went right back to the 80s and 90s. It's a fucking copy. So I don't see the value in that. Like, to me, when people talk about that, it's like totally, I'm like, why would you even spend the money to reinvent an earlier RX-7 motor that we already know works, to then potentially complain that it doesn't work in your application when we know that fundamentally works? I have concerns about displacing a flow, and this goes with intake and exhaust. And this is based on not personal experience, but 2 other engine builders that have told me this happened to them. And basically, on the intake side, if you totally cap off your center ports and you just leave your auxiliary secondaries, the rotors suck themselves due to a lack of displaced pressure to the side that doesn't have the port cavity. And I think in a hybrid, you'd still have the peripheral exhaust, which should displace enough air volume, or you're not going to cap the exhaust on the face. You're going to cap faceplate. You're going to cap the exhaust at the exit point, which still will allow vacuum pressure release, even though it won't allow flow. But basically, rotors need to have the ability to either hold vacuum equally on both sides, like full billet engines with absolutely no intake ports, equal on both sides, or cavities, so the rotor doesn't inadvertently build pressure or build vacuum to one side. And I have been told by 2 engine builders that they had substantial failures because the rotor sucked itself basically to one face due to an inverse pressure displacement.
When you say
I don't see...
When you say pulling a vacuum on one side or the other, are you referring to blocking intake or exhaust still?
So in the 2 failures, it was done on intake.
Okay.
And so my concern is, if you're going to do it on the exhaust, either do it all or don't do it, but don't do it unequally.
Okay.
So, like, if you see Mitchell on my header, the reason I didn't want to, everyone's like, oh, weld the thing shut in the center iron and do it that way. Well, the reason I left that tube that comes out is because you don't want, like Kyle saying, that there to be nowhere for the exhaust flow to go on the inside face of one rotor. So we're looking at the singular rotor, right? And you don't want it to try to like pull itself to one side. So by creating just a big hole there, a vacuum hole, you're not creating a super like negative pressure zero speed. You're just allowing air to move around, and it's not going to be, it's going to be zero, or it's going to be ambient,
Right.
whatever the pressure is. It's not going to be that crazy. Versus, in addition, I think this is why that guy that did his hybrid like had some success, is like capping it off, on just the face where the exhaust bolts up to, is giving you the volume there to not displace or affect the rotor itself in the combustion chamber. Because that's what you're trying to not, make mad. I think a lot of the internet like thinks when you want to, cap it off way up in there to prevent that from happening. But I think like that makes it worse, because you're gonna push the air somewhere else, and it's gonna damage something in the combustion chamber.
Interesting. Very interesting. And I'm glad you told me this now, because I was looking at your header. I was like, well, why do we have all these dead spaces for exhaust to sit? And we're going to have this weird flow essentially inside of the combustion chamber, or I guess the exhaust face of the rotor, as air's trying to figure out where it needs to flow and where it can and can't leave. My thought was, after we dyno this, I was like, well, I'm going to go take this and have it cleaned up and essentially block it right at the header or at the flange. But Kyle, what were you saying?
No, just I think that it was in agreement that you kind of need to have equal displacement, and everybody looks at it and they're like, oh, I'm just gonna cap things off or change it. And we really kind of know what works based on RX-7 motors. Like, we know peripheral exhaust works, and we know what works on Renesis. We know side port exhaust works. And to start to try to outsmart Mazda, as said earlier in this podcast, like, I don't think we're going to do it. Like, I think Mazda was really smart, and
you guys haven't been on an automotive design team, then I'm telling you.
From what I've seen fail, I wouldn't start to change pressure release to any large amount. I don't think there's a gain to be had there, even if it's more of a reliability thing.
So would you suggest that...
I would instantly see the rotor laying over, especially on a boosted motor, if you cap up the center and don't allow exhaust to go in there. I think you're just going to have a lot of pressure building on one side. It's going to push the rotor over. And it may not be an instant failure, but people are always concerned about reliability, and I don't think that's going to help it.
Yeah. And I think I'm one of those people that's concerned about reliability to some extent. At the same time, I didn't build a Renesis thinking it's going to last 10 years. But I definitely would like to try to get, 2 years of track work out of my car, probably 8 to 10 track visits at least.
It shouldn't be an issue.
Oh, okay.
It shouldn't be an issue.
Well, then if we got some more time left, maybe we'll have the funds to go ahead and start boosting mine then. So what about blocking the center and the sides and just running the peripheral port? Would you still have the same concerns? It sounds like if we're doing things equal on both sides...
Well, I just say why. Because all you did
That's a great question.
All you did right there is create a 1986 to 91 Mazda RX-7 motor. Okay. So then at that point, get rid of the actuators, fix your throttle body issue, and you have a motor that will work and will probably make slightly less than the Renesis, because they made slightly less than the Renesis.
No,
there's no reason it would make more.
I actually know they made less. I guess that makes sense. Interesting.
I think my old Series 5 FC half bridge port with the stock intake on an RTEC 1.8 ECU with the little Palm Pilot thing made like 170 wheel. And that was like jamming. Like, we were super pumped that's what that made. You know what I mean? And like, you could beat that pretty easily with a stock RX-8 would be right there. Just if it's a healthy 100 and plus compression engine, and you got good intake, header, exhaust, just bolt on parts, it's going to make 170, 180 horsepower to the tires. So, like you're saying, you're with the hybrid and deleting Renesis stuff, you're just making an RX-7. So, and it might be marginally better, but I think you're still just like, because you're deleting complexity, it's not going to be as good because it's less efficient, whereas like the old RX-7s are pretty simple. So like it just works because there's no extra, stuff in the way. There's no extra things convoluting everything. So
interesting.
I think as I thought about it, I think it might actually just lead to the same issue because what you're leaving is the component that's going to give you overlap. So you're blocking off the components that really aren't even involved at that point other than flow volume, and you're leaving the component that's actually what will make power in certain applications, but seems to be affecting the stock ECU's ability to properly register. I mean, I have some other thoughts that maybe we could go down, but I kind of think that this is my number one thought on that regarding why it's not working, and then why I wouldn't think that plugging the side ports would alleviate this problem.
Yeah, I want to stick with the 5-6 port, however you refer to the Siamese port and center. I want to hear your other ideas just out of curiosity. But real quick on the 5 port, Eric, you built this. I've been calling it like a 5 to 3 to 1 is essentially how it was originally built, right? You brought down the peripheral and the side ports on both sides. You brought those together, and then you brought it down to essentially a 3 to 1 collector in the center, and that was where you ran the center. So, Eric, I didn't know if you had experience building NA headers in the past, if that's where this came from, or if it was just, hey, this is the easiest route to go down. Where did this come in from?
I mean, like my kind of thought was I really wanted to focus the peripheral port on being the highest velocity of flow. I figured that mixing the side and the peripheral together, the distance there probably wouldn't have that big of an effect. More so combining rotor 1 and rotor 2 would be the ideal, where you're going to see the pulse variation to scavenge one from the other. So largely, like if you go on, I forget what forum it was, or maybe it was just my buddy Miles. My buddy Miles worked with what's the place? It's called Mosmart. Is it Jim Downing, right? I think down there with all the 4-rotor stuff. He worked down there with them, and they play around in the Savannah, Georgia, Atlanta rotary crew. And he was telling me that like, maybe between 18 to 20 inches would probably be the right distance to collect on like a ported Renesis. Bridge ports, you can do them shorter. Like there's a really short resonance zone, and then there's a longer resonance zone, and like you really have to time when the pulse velocity is right. And I'm not a scientist when it comes to that. I'm just taking the information from him. So that's kind of was my shot in the video, is like, let's combine it at about 18 to 20 inches and see where that effect is on that situation. Really the only reason I ran the so it's like a 2 to 1 to 2 to 1, right? The fifth one, the center port, was just because I didn't think capping it at the plate or mixing it down below or whatever was going to make that much of a difference. There's not, like, that port's so small, you're not going to see much velocity out of it. I just didn't want there to be like a carbon buildup or an excess of weird turbulence happening. So it was like, let me give this a big volume, expanse of a plenum, to let all the weird pulses and reversions just do their thing and not affect the flow from the other ports. I read something on one of my videos that was like, you should have combined the 2 side ports, the rotor 1, rotor 2, run those separate all the way down, combine them, and then take the peripheral ports and run those separate all the way down, combine them, and then combine them both. So like that would have been an interesting thing to try, because I think the flow velocity between the two is going to be very different. So the peripheral port is going to have a very high velocity, and the side port is not going to be going as fast. So, that could also be attributed or be a reason why that engine, mine didn't make any power through the mid-range, just because it's, maybe some of that peripheral port exhaust is doing weird stuff, circulating back through the side port. I don't really know, but that's where my head went right when I saw that comment. So that's the reason I do a header. I've never seen somebody do a 5 to 1. Everyone just does an RX-7 header,
right?
That like I talked to, and I was like, well, that's kind of boring. So let's make something crazy.
It shouldn't be enough to kill like 100 horsepower. And it seems like we should be able to almost put like a log manifold on there, and it still should get close. So I don't blame your exhaust. May not be optimized, but like you said, I think to get a job done and get some testing, I think it's totally reasonable. Um, and like when we did our turbo exhaust manifold, if there was gonna be a problem with like the peripheral exhaust being excessively fast and then causing some type of backflow to the center or to the outers, it seems to me like having a turbo sitting there and causing even more back pressure to the motor,
Mhm.
we would have seen that issue.
Yeah.
So again, to me, it's not a matter of like, do we need to cap a port or is there too much or too little? As we talk about the more in my mind, I'm like, oh yeah, this is an ECU or intake manifold issue.
Mhm.
Because you put a turbo on there, that's just causing more back pressure. You'll get
Mhm.
2 to 1 at least with most of what we're running. So put a cork there. We should have had some type of impact, and we had strong mid range, strong top end. So
Mhm.
it still seems unlikely to me that it would be a defect from the motor flow side versus an external issue causing loss
Mhm.
of horsepower or lack of usability. So again, coming back to, I wouldn't recommend capping any of the ports. We didn't see a need to do it. Um, didn't do it, and I have reasons to think that it may not be optimal in certain applications either.
Mhm.
Man, there's so many directions I want to take this conversation, but I've got to take it
But
to the
I'm happy if
yeah.
somebody tries it and it works. Hey, that's awesome. It's
Well, I'm not
that's
saying
like
I know.
what's cool about it. Yeah, yeah.
I'm asking
I
questions.
don't know. I only know what I've done.
Yeah. So now I think we have to ask the question of, well, why did Eric's motor start feeling stronger? I say feeling stronger because obviously we never got it back on the dyno when we started capping ports. Do we think it was an issue with just the layout of the header? Do we think that there's more power gains by bringing in the sides and then the peripherals and then running that to, I guess, a 3-to-1 or something? Kyle, I actually found a header that you had designed. It was in August of 2020. I'm going to share my screen. It's a chart I'm taking notes on. But this is a header that you shared, I think, with Mazda-Trix. It might have been on your Facebook. But I found this by Googling Mazda-Trix hybrid Renesis. So it looks like you've actually done something similar in the past.
Yeah, yeah,
That's
and
like
that
turbo
worked.
header.
So it's like, yeah, that's a
Well,
turbo
this, oh,
header.
that's right. This was for the turbo setup. You're right. I do remember seeing that picture right before I hopped on the call. Okay, that's right. So maybe
you can
just,
see.
or go ahead. Oh, I didn't have anywhere to go with that.
I was gonna say, like, to address your initial question, like why I think, because whenever I capped I cut the center port off and blocked it, and then capped the front and the rear Renesis ports. Then I effectively just had an RX-7 header, but with like 1.75" primary instead of 1.875 or whatever size primary.
Okay.
I think honestly it felt like it made more power because through the mid range it didn't have all of the just vacuum in the exhaust, and it had a little more back pressure. But then where that's going to help to like normalize some of that overlap and really just make the ECU a little happier. Because what you're going to see, or Kyle's talking to earlier, is like ECU doesn't know that it's wasting fuel with the overlap. So what's happening is it's probably an injector timing thing to pick up some power. Like I bet there's a lot of different tuning things you could change just on that setup and maybe make it more efficient. But basically, with overlap, you're just shoveling fuel from the intake straight down the face of the rotor and out the exhaust, and it's not getting burned. So, I think with a little more exhaust restriction, right, which is what I introduced, it's allowing a little more priority for that to get burned, which is going to make a little more power. In that case, because if you think about it, like imagine you've got the biggest exhaust ports, and you've got the big Bridgeport, and then you put like a 60 mil single throttle body on a Bridgeport engine, like it's not going to like that at all. So, but then if you restricted the exhaust back down, then the ports aren't going to matter, and it's going to be this restriction over here is more balanced to this restriction up here, and that's what's going to make the system more efficient. So I think that's kind of what I ran into with changing that. I would say it maybe picked up 15 horsepower, just like butt dyno. It still was not faster than my Green RX-8, and the Green RX-8's pretty tired. Like I would bet it makes 140 wheel, on a good day. So, but that's I think to be
Yeah.
attributed to like just you got to look at the flow characteristics of the whole system, and if you have a huge opening on one side, then this is going to be the control point. And I think that's just where I was at. There was too much exhaust flow for the intake's ability to keep up, and it was just restricting there, and then restricting the exhaust flow just increased the efficiency of the system a little bit, which made it a little bit better.
So let me ask you guys
That's
this.
a really.
No, go ahead, Cal.
I was just going to say that is a really good point, and I think the one thing that is a concern, and you're kind of mentioning it, is like if Mazda optimized the motor for its mid-range performance, peak performance, it's got these 3 different areas that its intake and its tuning is optimizing. Then us adding all of this extra air volume in naturally aspirated form should drop the horsepower on the bottom end and the mid-range. It could just be a dog naturally aspirated until you get it tuned and it hits 10 or 10.5 or 9.5, which a stock RX-8's not even going to get there unless it's
No.
been retuned or modified. But I don't think it's going to be that bad. But yeah, like any motor, you go really excessive with your intake porting and your exhaust porting, and yeah, have a limitation on the front end. You're decimating your bottom end performance. But again, I don't think it should have been so low. So I still think we're up against other tuning issues. But I guess I had not ever really thought about it. As a racer, I think in peak horsepower performance, and I'm going to operate in my window of power based on a gearbox. But yeah, when you're talking about a naturally aspirated motor, the Renesis hybrid is a ton of volume, and there needs to be restriction in certain areas to create proper velocity, and that is a whole area where maybe not porting the exhaust at all and not porting the intake at all could be the best form for that motor because it maybe already has too much air.
Yeah, and like I
unless you're
didn't
planning
port.
to boost it. Yeah.
Yeah, like I didn't port the GSLC housings at all. I just left it stock because I figured if I ported it, it would make it there'd be way too much exhaust flow, and
Potentially.
that was my intent, right? Now, like, I'm gonna take it back apart and build the hybrid for boost and then go bigger on everything and whatever. Because boosted, I think it'll be beneficial, but NA, I think there's just like, the reoccurring thought is Mazda optimized it, and I don't know that there's a better. I don't know. I think a fully custom intake would probably be the way to go. If you made a billet flange for the lower, brought it all up, combined it, some sort of a plenum, maybe emulate like an REW intake manifold. They flow really well, and just start there and put a big single throttle body on it and let it run. But I think, like your throttle body comments, like you're definitely going to want something bigger, because contrary to most people, like a 48 IDA flows a lot of air. Like that's a pretty big like airflow, and if you got good velocity stacks on it, like it's going to be rolling air through there, for a rotary, because that's as big as the header, intake wise, right? So as like a 48 to 52 millimeters is 2 inches, so you've got basically 2-inch primaries on the intake side, and I think there's just it's going to take basically reinventing an RX-7 to make a hybrid make more power, ultimately, right? So.
Yeah, and we talked about like aftermarket intakes, and one of the ones I wanted to try on a hybrid Renesis would have been like an ITB style. And again, yeah, you got to be up in like a 52 or plus, or in Australia, very not popular in the US, but here I'm gonna introduce some cool stuff in Australia. They do quad throttle bodies, and I think at that point you're getting a lot more volume. You have 4 smaller ITBs like 38s or 42s or 44s. So your total volume is very high, but your velocity is kept up. And that was a way they were able to get higher horsepower numbers out of the same motors. Basically, you take a peripheral port or a bridge port, and they could increase porting volume but maintain velocity by introducing more ITBs that weren't as big. And so like my thought was hybrid Renesis with ITBs, aftermarket ECU, and a decent header. And it it'll run.
Yeah.
I believe that'll totally run. And yeah, I don't know
Yep.
what the mid range will be, especially after this conversation. But
Mhm.
you know, I think it's got potential still.
But you got to beg me to put ITBs on my car. That's for sure. Hey,
Yeah.
if I've got
I
the
mean,
money,
that's
I'd love to test out some ITBs.
Yeah.
Um,
You run some
yeah.
like OBX, like the Honda ones, an OBX quad setup, super
Mhm.
cheap if they still have them out there on eBay, and just yeah, a little CNC'd or welded up tubular runner manifold, and I think
Mhm.
you'd probably be better off than a stock RX-8 intake, based on all of the dynoing and research we did at Mazda Tricks. You know, when you get into GT racing or IMSA or any of the naturally aspirated road racing categories, they're never running the stock intake manifolds on rotary engines.
Okay.
Non-existent. It's all aftermarket ITB stuff.
Yeah. Because here's the other interesting thing, just to make mention of. On Johnny's four-rotor engine, it has the slide throttles, and they're 54 millimeters, and they're ginormous, each one. But IMSA Racing and somebody's Street RX-8, the drivability of Johnny's car is non-existent. Like, it sucks. It's the worst car ever to drive in traffic. It's either like all or nothing, because you have 10% throttle is so much airflow. So that's where, like, if you do go to an ITV setup, you're like, we're talking making it make more peak power, but there's always a balance of more
right.
power means sacrifice and drivability
Yeah.
means, there's a balance in there. So like, I've seen guys run like Hayabusa throttle bodies or carburetors on stuff. And like, they're probably in the 40 mil, like a big 30 mil range, as far as diameter, but you have four of them. It's like you were saying, the velocity is great. With a smaller diameter, you do get some better transient drivability, even with like a bigger total flow than say a big single. So there is some balance there, but that's where, like, your average RX-8 owner doesn't want to spend, $1,000 figuring out a new intake manifold. You know what I mean? Like, he'd rather be
Yeah.
able to buy something that comes off the shelf that's like, this gets you 10 horsepower, or whatever, right? So that's where unlike the FDs and the RX-7s, there isn't a full, and even really for FDs and RX or FDs and older RX-7s, there isn't a full spread of options as far as aftermarket intake manifolds. You're pretty limited on a few different billet ones or some cast ones that are reasonably affordable, or you're finding old, like, excessive ones that are laying around that don't get made, or elites or whatever brand. Like, they don't. It's just there's not a lot of support for the FD, and there's even less in that situation for an RX-8. So that's where I think a lot of, like me or whoever, like, I'm not giving up on an NA hybrid, but it's just you lose your traction pretty quick when there's no,
Yeah.
crank the budget way. And I'm a decent fabricator, but I don't have a TIG, so I can't just experiment and make stuff like that. I mean, I don't really want to, like, pay the tuition myself to learn it. So it's an interesting ball game to play
Yeah.
as even for Kyle and I, like, as engine builders, who want to play with these things and experiment, to be able to invest the time and money to try to push something that, like, it might make 220 horsepower, but you're going to have a whole bunch of money in it. And
Right.
like my full bridge 12A with a 50 mil DCO makes 200 horsepower, and like, that's a couple hours worth of Dremel and stack it up, prove it, no questions asked. So it's an interesting, uh, you know, finding a place to put your time and money is always interesting when it comes to this stuff, and R&D, right?
Yeah. And to be honest, it's funny. If I had this conversation before I bought my rotor housings, I'd probably like, okay, I think I've heard enough. We're just going to put a Ford 2.5 in it, call it a day. But here I am now. I've already spent the money, and I'm just like, well, at this point, I'm just ready for a car. Oh, you guys don't know how
Yeah.
miserable I've been this season without a car to race. I was so
But I
excited
think
to hop in my Saturn.
But I think the beneficial place where you're at, though, Mitchell, is with the hybrid that you've built, is you can boost that engine and have what I'm going to say is probably going to be a healthier, more reliable turbo RX-8 than just about every other stock Renesis
Yeah.
turbo. So, like, even if you went out and just grabbed a Greddy turbo kit off the shelf, slapped it on, like, modified it for the hybrid ports, slapped it on your car, it's going to be way more efficient, way more happy. The EGTs are going to be way better. Like, it's just going to manage heat way better. So, like, to me, that's where the hybrid shines. Is like the guy that wants a 300 horsepower RX-8, a hybrid Renesis with a stock intake on a plug and play ECU with a decent turbo kit, like, that becomes more reliable. Because making 300 on just a stock Renesis block, like, Ernie breaks front irons, like, he melted the exhaust sleeves out of it. Like, I mean, it's like, that's the limit of that basically for what I'm going to call the average owner. Like Kyle or I can have a car that breaks often. We're a shop. We can fix it. We know how to do it. Right. But like, if we're going to say, hey, this guy wants a turbo RX-8, I'm going to say 220, 230 horsepower is all you're going to reliably get out of it. For me to say, like, it's not going to break, have fun.
Yeah.
Right. Because, like, like there's a balance in that, too, of like, how do you sell somebody on what they need in their engine to have a reliable car? Because ultimately, rotaries, like, we can kind of admit, aren't as reliable as other performance sports cars in a sense. And then you modify them and it becomes even worse. So it's like you have to balance what you want to give or sell or tell somebody's going to work, or what I would put in a video and say, do this, because I still feel reasonably liable for if I make a video that like, this is my port that works and somebody doesn't and it breaks, like I'm still not going to feel that good about it. So
absolutely,
I still think your engine is like, for a street RX-8 ready turbo kit, 280 wheel, it would be a blast at that power level. Super reliable, especially with RX-7 Apex seals. Like, it's going to be a great engine. So
yeah, interesting. Yeah, I think I've pretty much determined or decided that this year it's gonna. Well, I say this year. Next year it's gonna be NA, and I would love to do as much research as I can. But I think what I'm gonna fall back on is exactly what you're bringing up, Eric. Is how much money do I really spend to find out that we're still missing horsepower when I could just spend this money to boost the RX-8? And I'm just here to make some cool content. That's what I'm down to do. That's what I'm trying to do. I'm not a professional videographer. I just want to share an experience with everybody. I still think that there's more to share here. I'm going to be running into funds, I think. I've pretty much decided originally before this call, because I thought the big restriction was the exhaust. The exhaust is the problem. You got to figure something out and make a decision. I was going to dyno it with the current header, which I'm doing no matter what, because I want something that we can compare side by side and eliminate one variable, like I said before. Sounds like that variable is the intake, which is more of a concern than I originally knew. So I'm going to dyno that, and then my plan was to redo the exhaust over the winter. But it almost sounds like you guys are telling me, it almost sounds like we just modify the intake and then modify the exhaust back to the full 5 ports. So is that where we're at? It sounds like the next step is to, like I said, dyno my car the way it is, hopefully very soon. And then over the winter, open up the exhaust, essentially rebuild the 5-to-1 that you had, Eric, and then open up my intake with an aftermarket intake. Is that the idea here?
I'd like to see that. I think that's got potential.
Yeah. I mean, I think like you could probably have a company or, your engineering or me or whoever could draw something up in SolidWorks to simply just bolt a Turbo 2 or a FD intake on an RX-8, like an adapter, like they did for all the old school stuff, E2 to FD or whatever, right?
Yeah.
And I bet that's going to eliminate the RX-8 intake completely. All the resonance, all the weird stuff. Go to a cable throttle body, put it on a standalone ECU. Like, I think your biggest hurdle is going to be having to get an ECU to go to a different intake, right? Because you're never going to get the stock ECU to run anything but the RX-8 intake.
Okay.
Like, that's just not going to happen. So, to me, that's like your next step, or the next step for the hybrid in general is like, you've got to, you could try aftermarket ECU with the stock RX-8 intake, see what it does. And then I think it's going to pick up power with an aftermarket, or I say aftermarket, with a custom intake. Somebody's got to build something, but you're just going to need to get more flow in because the hybrid's getting it out. So that's my
I think
inner thoughts. But
and I totally agree. And just one of the thoughts I had was using one of those same adapters to go from RX-8 to FD or some other generation of Mazda. And then you could potentially use one of the carburetor manifolds and then go to an ITB, not a carburetor, but an ITB. Slightly more expensive than using an OEM setup, but we have a lot of data supporting like what we were talking about, like a 48 style or 50 millimeter. So it kind of puts it in a relevant category. It's like, oh, we know a 51 millimeter IDA on a ported massive street port 1986 to 91 block does what did it do, 250 260 horsepower at the flywheel. Like, we've got those dyno charts, so it's like if you mimic that intake, and somehow get it tuning, it does give a base. It's like, oh, hey, we lost bottom end and we gained top end, or oh, lost stuff everywhere, or here was the gain. There's
Mhm.
some relatability as where like I wouldn't be able to tell you how much horsepower a 6-port style motor makes with a RX-7 style intake unless it's actually a 6-port intake.
Yeah.
So just for like being able to quantify what horsepower actually means, there is some similarities that could be drawn upon.
Hmm.
Man, this is super cool. Yeah, I'm learning a lot here. Kyle, I'm sorry. You said earlier when they were running the 4 ITBs, I thought you said a 48 millimeter it wasn't 48 millimeter. What size ITBs were they running?
So I could get some data for you on what the quads were. I seem to think it was like 42 millimeter quad,
Oh,
the
okay.
442s.
Just in
But
the
they
ballpark
might
is
have
really
been
what I was
bigger
looking
or
for.
smaller. Yeah.
Okay.
And then when you're running like twin, like IDA style, we usually, to make any power, you're usually running a 51 millimeter IDA
Hmm.
style. That could be ITBs or carburetor. And there's aftermarket and just different stuff. The old Webers or Gene or actual ITB stuff. Redline, some other companies out there. Um,
Yeah.
but yeah, I
Do you
think
look up
again,
like?
like, we know we have data on like ITV setups. So if you mimic a setup like that, it kind of does give some relativity of horsepower numbers. And if we go to like uniqueness where you go to like a quad throttle body, I think there's probably more impact when it comes to media content because like that's two things nobody's doing:
Mm-hmm.
hybrids and quad throttle bodies, which look really cool. And we know
Mhm.
they work because we've got data from Australia. But it does put you in a category where it's like a variable that we don't have. But I can get you some information on those quad setups and
Yeah.
what they were doing. It's neat. That's
Absolutely,
kind of where I wanted to go with it, but I'm happy to help other people as well.
Oh
gentlemen.
yeah, for sure.
I was hoping to have some money opening up for my cheap 4-wheel drive project, Eric, that I was telling you about. But I'm telling you what, you're really getting me talked into. The car's gonna be sitting all winter. You guys are gonna have me spending money on a
Just
aftermarket
turbocharge
ECU.
Yeah.
Well,
Just turbo.
yeah,
Yeah, I mean, I think like ultimately this is like what I always tell people is like you got to have an expectation of what you want the car to do, right? So like if somebody
Yeah.
wants a reliable, normal like a V6 Camaro-esque car, the RX-8 in stock form is a great car. Got a back seat, same gas mileage. It's just going to be a little bit slower, but it's going to be a little more unique. If you want an RX-7 on a budget, the RX-8 is not really the car to do that with.
right.
Like you should just go buy like a 350Z or something else that takes modifications easier because that's ultimately what RX-7s are. They're easy to modify, they make good horsepower, and they sound cool, right? So you kind of have to like set that expectation for yourself. I think a boosted RX-8 is a very viable option, but everyone goes into it with the expectation of it being an RX-7, and it's not. So it's a
Yeah,
management thing
yeah,
there, but
yeah. I don't think I
it's
was
always fun.
chasing like a budget RX-7 or anything like that. For me, like I said, I was pretty content with my NC Miata. If anything, I almost regret it. It's an absolute turd, but I just loved it. Yeah, my goal, honestly, with the RX-8 when I got done was to have something that performed like my NC, but my son could ride in the back of, and
Yep.
I really just needed to sound cool so that he was impressed, and that was the box that it needed to check. And then I just needed to be able to go thrash it all summer long at the track.
Yeah, and I think it'll do it just fine. I mean,
Right.
hybrid NA at 140, 150, 160 wheel, whatever it makes, like
Yeah.
it's going to be a fun rotary drive,
Yeah.
like my green RX-8 is very, very slow compared to everyone else's RX-8s, I promise. And it's super fun to put it on the bumper of like
Oh, yeah.
Porsches at the racetrack because you just don't lift. You just floor it as soon as you let off the brakes.
Yeah.
And like that's the power of RX-8s and Miatas, a lot of these slower, fun cars. It's,
Yeah. I'll be honest.
Decide you don't need the straight line speed.
I'd be all right with a little bit more horsepower because I've got too many clips of me and my Miata trying to pass. I was trying to pass a C7 Corvette at Gingerman, and this dude didn't lift, and he gave me the point by, and I'm flat out, and he's just pulling away. I was like, "What do you think I'm going to do here, brother?" I was like, "You're going to gap me the whole way down this straightaway." But I don't know, man. Part of me hates now to be like, you know what, the budget now has come up. We're just going to boost it and be done with it. Just because I had so many people just do this, just do this. I was like, well, I was kind of having fun with the research part, but at the same time, I'm like, I really don't want to just burn $2,000 and be like, all right, well, it made 160 horsepower. It's time to boost it. So,
Yep. Yeah, but that's the thing about the internet, right? Is everyone's smarter than you. So it's always fun to jump in the comments and read them. And like I kind of saw through all the comments on a lot of stuff and was like, I don't think this is gonna work, but here's my like honest try.
yeah.
You know, as far as not going to work, meaning it's not going to make 230 horsepower, you know, or
Right.
50, or like it's going to be a Renesis at best, right? And that's not a bad thing. It's just that's the expectation. But I still think the hybrid definitely has its place as like efficient turbo RX-8. Like I think it's still a good, viable option, you know, for somebody who wants to tinker and have fun. But
yeah,
I'm interested to follow along with whatever you go through, and let me know any questions or anything you need, and we can get it sorted out. I know we're not too far away. Kyle, I'll probably see you at 7 Stock this year for sure if you go. So we'll be making the trek with the 4-rotor car and a few other things. So it'll be interesting to come out and catch up.
When is 7 Stock?
November 10th. I don't know the number, but it's the 10th. One of the 10th, I think.
That'd be a lot of fun to go out to. I remember I heard about it last year, and I think that was right as I bought my car. And I was like, man, that'd be a lot of fun to go out. Maybe I'll have to look it up and go out. Yeah. I need to do some more research on, I guess, boosting my car, because honestly, I wouldn't even know where to start. I haven't looked at it because I was like, all right, well, that's a next winter thing. But maybe it's a situation where if I have to do an aftermarket and if I have to do an aftermarket intake and an ECU anyway, maybe it'd be worth just going ahead and assembling it in A before I start building the header and such. Maybe I'll go into that.
I think
route.
like in your situation, I would take the header that I gave you with the engine mount and just put your car together and drive it.
Well, that's what I'm gonna do right now. Yeah. I want to have fun with it the rest of the year.
And then once you've got the little bit of wherewithal tuning, you know how it reacts, etc., then you know you can probably piece together a decent intake manifold for not that much money, you know, to try. But the thing of it is you're gonna have to go standalone first to manage any aftermarket intake manifold. So,
okay,
you know, at that point is where like standalone boosted, standalone this, what's the, you know, option. I think Greddy turbo kits can still be had for not that super expensive. So you could probably you know, get away with just buying one of those or something too. So
yeah, and if I do any of that, it'll be December timeframe. Or go ahead, Kyle.
I was just gonna say I'll have a chat with my tuner, Nelson, who does all the KMR and Mazda trick stuff, and see if he has any insight on what we might be able to do within the stock ECU. It's been a while since we did anything with stock RX-8s, but I know for a while we were, you know, reflashing them and playing with them, and you could do some stuff. So, and just because I don't know, I'm going to go talk to him about what the limitations are that he was seeing, just so I can follow up with you guys and see if there's anything I can add to this this puzzle.
Yeah, for sure.
Well, I guess, were there any other topics you guys wanted to discuss? I think there's still a whole further rabbit hole, but man, we'd be here till who knows when.
Yeah.
I think it was cool to chat, and I still think there's potential for the NA hybrid, but I think like we at Mazda Tricks and KMR, we always kind of looked at it as this is like a hot rod motor or a race motor, and I guess we're very used to just, equal length header, aftermarket intake, ECU, what do you need? And I think within that potential, there's still a peak horsepower number that we don't know what it is. But I think, for like the average RX-8 owner, if you're looking for a street combination, that's probably not an average street combination to go for. You'd have to really want to do that for a specific reason.
Yeah, I remember just trying to find somebody to cut my rotors to take the RX-7 Apex seals. I thought that was going to be easy. That was already difficult enough. A huge shout out, by the way. I was going to give a shout out to Rotary Science. The guy was an absolute pleasure to work with. He was down to do whatever. Held my hand through everything. He was a great help. But yeah, Kyle, on your comment, I think you'd be surprised. Even the guys building these things at home, they're going balls to the wall. I talked to a guy named Carlos Berman Carlos. I apologize. I'm probably messing up his name. Carlos_FXB on Instagram. But he built a hybrid Renesis and stuck it in a Repu. And it's got some nitrous to play with as well. He did, if my notes are correct, he did RX-7 seals. He lost a rubber plug on one, had to rebuild it. He actually did your KMR bridge, and then I think he had RX-7 seals, and then he had added 2-runner. I don't remember what this note is, but yeah, his was fairly modified as well. I think he had a log. Yeah, he was the one with the log manifold, and essentially he just routed 2 additional pipes off to reuse the factory header. Travis Lichtenberg may have messed his name up too, but he actually used a 12A center plate on his, I guess. That's what he told me. And then he had RX-7 seals, and then he described it as heavily ported by the time he got done. And I think he said that it made essentially stock power levels. It also wasn't anything incredible. So, yeah, I don't think anybody has really built something that's not extremely messed with. You know, a stock intake, stock exhaust, just the rotor housings.
And I think that was part of the point is we had an abundance of Renesis motors sitting around that nobody knew how to use them in anything other than stock form. And with limited options, it's like, yeah, if you want to put a Renis into a hot rod or a Repu or anything, like the Renesis just isn't that cool. How do you make it cool? Well, the hybrid or these other configurations, and I'm so happy to hear people are making them work in weird configurations, but like that was the whole point. How do we use these blocks?
Yeah.
Otherwise, they're boat anchors.
Yeah. Boy, I found it's a real heavy boat anchor thanks to all that cast iron. Jeez. I didn't realize how heavy this thing was. So, okay.
I'm just happy to see people using them, and my advocation is for like fundamentally it's just a rotary, so it'll work. We disregarding the factory ECU, it looks like at this point, and this is a conversation I never got to have until this point. But yeah, we know regarding like the characteristics of the motor, at least my view is like, yeah, we know it runs, we know it works. And it looks like you can fool around with the configuration more than I would personally.
More than I probably should have as well.